a slave's sunrise, a philosopher's dawn. The first light of dawn touches the ancient stones of Hierapolis, painting them in shades of amber and rose. Steam rises from the sacred hot springs, creating wisps of mist that dance between marble columns and forgotten temples. This is Phrygia, in what we now call Turkey, around the year 50 CE. And somewhere in this city of healing waters and white travertine terraces, a child is born who will change how we think about freedom itself. His name is Epictetus. He enters the world not as a citizen, not as a free man, but as property, a slave. In the Roman Empire, this means his body belongs to another. His time is not his own. His choices are dictated by someone else's will. Yet from this most constrained beginning will emerge one of history's most liberating philosophies. Picture him as a boy, walking these same streets where the morning light now falls. The wealthy Romans come here to bathe in the therapeutic springs, to cure their ailments, to restore their bodies. But for a slave child, there is no such luxury. His days are shaped by service, by the needs of others, by the constant awareness that he exists at someone else's pleasure. And yet something extraordinary is happening in this young mind, something that no chain can bind, no master can own. He is learning to distinguish between what he can control and what he cannot. This distinction will become the foundation of everything he teaches, but it begins here, in childhood, born from necessity rather than philosophy. The sun climbs higher now, burning away the morning mist. In the distance, you can hear the sounds of the city awakening. Merchants preparing their stalls, servants drawing water, the clip-clop of horses on stone streets. For most people, these are simply the sounds of another day beginning. But for someone learning to see the world as Epictetus does, they become something more. Reminders that life is constantly in motion, constantly changing, and that our peace depends not on controlling these external movements, but on understanding our relationship to them. As a slave, Epictetus cannot choose where he lives or how he spends his days. He cannot choose his master or his circumstances, but he can choose something far more profound. He can choose how he responds to what happens to him. This choice, invisible to those around him, becomes his secret freedom. Imagine the strength this requires: to be owned by another human being, to have your body treated as property, and yet to maintain sovereignty over your own mind, to recognize that while others may control your external circumstances, your thoughts, your judgments, your inner responses remain entirely your own. The Romans have a saying, "Fortuna caeca est," fortune is blind. Good luck and bad luck strike without reason or justice. For a slave, this might seem like cruel wisdom. After all, what greater misfortune could there be than to be born into bondage? But Epictetus will transform this apparent curse into the very foundation of his liberation. He learns early that suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our judgments about what happens to us. A revolutionary idea, especially for someone whose daily reality includes genuine hardship, real limitations, actual pain. This isn't the comfortable philosophy of someone who has never known struggle. This is wisdom forged in the fire of lived experience. The morning light grows stronger, revealing more details of this ancient city. You can see the elaborate Roman baths, the temples dedicated to gods both Greek and Roman, the marketplace where people from across the empire come to trade. It's a cosmopolitan place, a crossroads of cultures and ideas. And perhaps this diversity plants seeds in young Epictetus's mind. The understanding that there are many ways to see the world, many ways to live within it. But there's something else happening in these early years, something that will shape his entire philosophy. He's learning the difference between what the Stoics will later call preferred indifference and true good and evil. Freedom is generally preferable to slavery. Yes. Health is generally preferable to sickness. Wealth is generally preferable to poverty. But none of these external conditions can touch what is truly valuable in a human being: the capacity for wisdom, for virtue, for choosing our responses to whatever life brings. This doesn't mean Epictetus becomes passive or resigned. Far from it. It means he becomes strategically focused on where his power actually lies. He cannot change his legal status as a slave, but he can develop an unshakable inner dignity. He cannot control his master's moods or demands, but he can control his own character in responding to them. The sun is fully risen now, casting sharp shadows between the ancient buildings. In one of these shadows, perhaps, a young slave is learning lessons that will eventually reach the ears of emperors. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor himself, will study Epictetus's teachings. Think about that extraordinary reversal, a slave's wisdom guiding the most powerful man in the world. But that's still years in the future. For now, there is just this boy, these streets, this daily practice of inner freedom. He's learning to see his circumstances not as his identity, but as his training ground. Every command from his master becomes an opportunity to practice obedience without resentment. Every hardship becomes a chance to develop resilience. Every moment of powerlessness becomes a reminder of where his true power lies. This isn't easy wisdom. It's not the kind of philosophy you can simply read about and understand. It has to be lived, practiced, tested against real difficulty. And Epictetus is getting that testing every single day. The ancient Stoics believed that we are all actors in a play, and our job is not to choose our role, but to play it excellently. For now, Epictetus's role is that of a slave. Later, it will be that of a teacher, a philosopher, a guide for others seeking freedom. But the excellence he brings to each role will be the same. The excellence of someone who understands that our circumstances are temporary, but our character is eternal. As the morning progresses, the city fills with activity. Roman citizens conducting business, slaves hurrying on errands, visitors from distant provinces seeking healing in the famous springs. Each person carrying their own burdens, their own struggles, their own search for something better. What Epictetus is beginning to understand, though he may not yet have words for it, is that everyone is seeking the same thing: freedom from suffering, peace of mind, a sense of dignity and purpose. The Roman citizen worries about his reputation, his wealth, his political standing. The slave worries about his master's approval, his basic survival, his uncertain future. But both are seeking happiness in things outside their control. True freedom, Epictetus is learning, comes from recognizing what is up to us and what is not up to us. Our opinions, our desires, our actions, our responses, these are up to us. Everything else, other people's behavior, the weather, our past, our reputation, even our own bodies, is not up to us. This sounds simple, but it's perhaps the most difficult lesson a human being can learn. We spend so much energy trying to control things that are ultimately beyond our influence. We suffer not because bad things happen, but because we think bad things shouldn't happen. We struggle not against reality, but against our judgments about reality. The springs of Hierapolis have been flowing for thousands of years before Epictetus's birth, and they will flow for thousands of years after. They don't struggle against their nature or wish they were something else. They simply are what they are, doing what they do. There's a lesson in this constancy, this acceptance of natural order. But humans are different from springs. We have consciousness, choice, the ability to resist or accept our circumstances. This gift of awareness is also our burden. We can imagine things being different than they are. We can remember past happiness and anticipate future pleasure. We can judge and compare and wish and hope and fear. Epictetus is learning to see this human capacity for judgment as both our greatest vulnerability and our greatest strength. Used unwisely, it creates endless suffering as we rail against things we cannot change. Used wisely, it becomes the source of unshakable peace as we align ourselves with reality rather than fighting it. The day grows warmer now. Somewhere in this ancient city, a young slave is taking the first steps on a journey that will lead him from physical bondage to philosophical freedom, from powerlessness to profound influence, from being owned by another to becoming a teacher of liberation. His story is just beginning, but already in these early years of constraint and hardship, the seeds of wisdom are taking root. The same sun that rises over Hierapolis today rose over his world 2,000 years ago. The same human struggles with control and acceptance, with suffering and peace, with finding meaning in difficult circumstances, and the same possibility that transformed a nameless slave into an immortal teacher remains available to each of us. The possibility of discovering that true freedom has nothing to do with our external circumstances and everything to do with how we choose to meet whatever life brings our way. Rome's embrace, from bondage to the bustle. That journey would take him far from the healing springs of Hierapolis to the beating heart of the ancient world. Rome, in the year 52 CE, was a symphony of chaos and grandeur. Imagine, if you will, stepping into the Forum Romanum at dawn. The marble columns catching the first light, casting long shadows across stones worn smooth by a million footsteps. The air thick with the scent of bread baking in nearby shops, mingling with incense from a dozen temples and the less pleasant aromas of a city where nearly 1 million souls lived pressed together. By the time the sun climbed higher, the Forum would pulse with life. Merchants calling out their wares in a dozen languages, senators in their pristine togas hurrying to important meetings, children darting between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing off ancient walls, the sound of hammers on metal from the workshops, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on stone, the rumble of wooden wheels carrying goods from every corner of the known world. This was the Rome that young Epictetus entered, not as a tourist marveling at its wonders, but as property, a possession, a thing to be bought, sold, used as another man saw fit. His new master was Epaphroditus, a name that meant lovely or charming in Greek. How strange that such a beautiful name would belong to a man who would become synonymous with both opportunity and suffering in Epictetus's life. Epaphroditus was no ordinary Roman citizen. He served in the household of Emperor Nero himself, a freedman who had once been enslaved but had earned his liberty and now wielded considerable influence in the imperial court. This was not uncommon in Rome. Former slaves often became some of the most powerful people in the empire, managing the vast bureaucracy that kept the world's greatest civilization running. But power, as Epictetus would learn, does not automatically confer wisdom or kindness. The house where Epictetus would spend his young adult years stood on the Palatine Hill, within sight of the emperor's palace. From certain windows you could see the Circus Maximus, where 250,000 Romans would gather to watch chariot races, their cheers rising like thunder across the 7 hills. You could glimpse the construction of what would one day be called the Colosseum, though in Epictetus's time it was still just an ambitious dream in Nero's mind. Living so close to the center of power meant witnessing history unfold. Sometimes in whispered conversations between important visitors, sometimes in the sudden appearance of the Praetorian Guard in the streets below, sometimes in the way Epaphroditus would return from the palace, his face tight with worry or flushed with triumph, depending on how the political winds were blowing that day. For a young man with a keen mind and observant nature, it was an education unlike any other. Epictetus learned to read the subtle signs of power: who was rising, who was falling, how quickly fortune could change in the imperial court. He saw how wealth and status, the very things most people spent their lives pursuing, could vanish overnight at the whim of an emperor or the turn of political tide. But perhaps more importantly, He began to see how even the most powerful people in the world were, in many ways, enslaved. Enslaved to their fears, their desires, their need for approval. He watched senators who commanded legions tremble at a raised eyebrow from Nero. He saw wealthy merchants lose sleep over market fluctuations they could not control. He observed how the pursuit of external things, money, status, pleasure, seemed to bring not freedom but a different kind of bondage. These observations were shaping his understanding, but it wasn't until he encountered a particular teacher that everything began to crystallize into a coherent philosophy of life. Musonius Rufus, a name that might not be familiar to you, but one that echoes through the halls of wisdom like a bell struck in a quiet temple. He was known as the Roman Socrates, a Stoic philosopher who had the rare courage to speak truth to power, even when that power belonged to emperors. The exact circumstances of how Epictetus first encountered Musonius are lost to history, but we can imagine the scene. Perhaps it was in one of the covered porticos where philosophers gathered to teach, their voices competing with the sounds of commerce and politics that never ceased in Rome. Perhaps Epictetus, despite his flaws, recognized the intelligence in his young slave and allowed him to attend these sessions. Or perhaps, and this feels more likely given what we know of Epictetus's character, he found ways to slip away when his duties allowed, drawn by rumors of a teacher who spoke about freedom in ways that had nothing to do with legal status or social position. Picture the first time he heard Musonius speak. The philosopher's voice cutting through the noise of the city like a clear stream through muddy water. Here was a man teaching that virtue was the only true good. That wisdom could be cultivated by anyone, slave or emperor, that the universe itself was rational and benevolent, if only we could learn to see it clearly. For a young man who had already begun to sense these truths through his own experience and observation, hearing them articulated with such clarity must have been like coming home, like finding the words for feelings he had carried but could never quite express. Musonius taught that philosophy was not an abstract intellectual exercise, but a way of life, a daily practice, a set of tools for navigating whatever circumstances life might bring. He emphasized that what happened to us mattered far less than how we chose to respond to what happened to us. Does this sound familiar? It should, because these were the very insights that Epictetus had been developing since childhood, refined now through the teaching of a master who had walked this path before him. Under Musonius's guidance, Epictetus began to understand that his physical bondage, painful as it was, could not touch the part of him that truly mattered, his capacity to think, to choose his responses, to find meaning in his circumstances. These remained entirely his own. He learned to see his daily life as a kind of training ground. Each interaction with Epictetus, each menial task, each moment of frustration or humiliation became an opportunity to practice the principles he was learning, to distinguish between what was up to him and what was not, to focus his energy only on what he could actually influence. The bustling streets of Rome became his classroom. The marble halls of his master's house became his monastery. The very constraints of his enslaved life became the raw material for developing an unshakable inner freedom. And slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, something extraordinary was taking shape, not just in Epictetus's understanding, but in his very being, a kind of peace that did not depend on circumstances, a strength that could not be taken away by any external force, a wisdom that would one day echo through centuries, touching millions of lives, including perhaps your own. Because even now, as you listen to this ancient story, you are participating in the same process of transformation that began in the noisy streets of imperial Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. The same recognition that true freedom cannot be granted or taken away by others. but must be discovered and cultivated within ourselves. Echoes of wisdom, the teachings of Musonius Rufus. But before we can understand how deeply this wisdom would transform Epictetus, we must first understand the man who would become his teacher. Musonius Rufus was unlike any philosopher Rome had ever known. While other teachers gathered wealth and sought the favor of emperors, Musonius lived simply, deliberately. His small lecture hall near the Forum was sparse, almost austere. Wooden benches worn smooth by countless students, walls bare except for the play of afternoon light filtering through high windows. There was something revolutionary in this simplicity, something that whispered of deeper truths. When Epictetus first entered that quiet space, still bearing the marks of his chains, he found not grand rhetoric or elaborate theories. Instead, he discovered something far more powerful, a way of thinking that cut through the noise of the world, straight to the heart of what it means to be human. Musonius would begin each lesson the same way, with a question so simple it seemed almost childlike. What happened to you today that disturbed your peace? Students would share their frustrations. A merchant had cheated them. A friend had betrayed their trust. The emperor had issued another unpopular decree. Rain had ruined their plans. And then, the real teaching would begin. "Tell me," Musonius would say gently, "which part of this experience actually belongs to you?" This was the foundation of everything. The recognition that in any situation, any circumstance, there are always two distinct elements: what happens and what we make of what happens. The merchant's dishonesty, that belonged to the merchant. The friend's betrayal, that was their choice, their character revealed. The emperor's decree, his responsibility, the rain, simply weather, following its own natural patterns. But the story you tell yourself about these events, the meaning you assign, the emotions you choose to feed, the actions you decide to take in response, these belong entirely to you. This wasn't just philosophy. This was practical wisdom for daily life. Epictetus absorbed these teachings like parched earth receives rain. Here was the framework for insights he had been developing through years of hardship. Here was language for truths he had sensed but couldn't yet articulate. In that quiet lecture hall, surrounded by the gentle murmur of thoughtful voices, something profound was taking shape, not just in Epictetus's mind, but in his very soul. Musonius taught that most human suffering comes from a simple confusion. We exhaust ourselves trying to control things that are not ours to control, while neglecting the one realm where we have complete authority: our own thoughts, our own responses, our own choices about how to meet each moment. Imagine, Musonius would say, that you are the ruler of a great city, but instead of governing your own citizens, you spend all your time trying to control the weather in distant lands. How would your city fare? The students would laugh, seeing the absurdity immediately. Yet this is exactly what we do, he would continue, when we allow our peace to depend on things beyond our influence. There was such relief in this understanding, such unexpected freedom. For Epictetus, this teaching unlocked something revolutionary. He began to see that his physical chains, painful as they were, had never actually touched his essential self. They had constrained his body, but his mind remained sovereign. His capacity to choose his response to any situation that remained untouchable. Day after day, in that simple room, he practiced this new way of seeing. When news arrived of some political upheaval, instead of immediately reacting with fear or anger, he would pause, ask himself, what part of this belongs to me? When his master was harsh, instead of burning with resentment, he would remember, His behavior reveals his character. My response reveals mine. This wasn't about becoming passive or accepting injustice. It was about responding from a place of clarity rather than reactivity, about choosing your battles wisely and fighting them from a position of inner strength. The other students noticed the change in him. There was a calmness about Epictetus now, a steadiness that seemed to come from some deep well within. Even in his slave's tunic, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that no external circumstance could diminish. Musonius saw it too. In this young man who had known such hardship, he recognized something rare, not just intellectual understanding, but the kind of wisdom that comes from applying these principles in the crucible of real life. Remember, Musonius would often say, philosophy is not about clever words or impressive arguments. It is about how you live, how you meet difficulty, how you treat others, how you respond when life doesn't go according to your plans. And Epictetus was living proof of these teachings. Here was someone who had every reason to be bitter, angry, broken by his circumstances. Instead, he was becoming something else entirely, a person who had found freedom in the most unlikely place, not despite his suffering, but because of how he had chosen to meet it. In that quiet lecture hall, surrounded by the timeless wisdom of the Stoics, Epictetus was discovering a truth that would echo through centuries, that the most profound freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the presence of choice. The choice to respond rather than react, to act from wisdom rather than impulse, to find peace not in controlling the uncontrollable, but in fully embracing what is truly yours, your thoughts, your responses, your character, your contribution to this moment, and the next, and the next. This is the freedom that no external force can touch, the freedom that begins, always, from within. Inner fortitude, finding freedom in restraint. This freedom, this inner sovereignty that Epictetus discovered. It wasn't something that arrived suddenly. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation. Instead, it grew quietly, steadily, through countless small choices made in the ordinary moments of each day. Picture him in those early morning hours before the household stirred, the stone floor cold beneath his feet, the weight of another day's duties ahead. But in those precious moments of stillness, he would practice. Not grand gestures of defiance, not bitter rehearsals of injustice, but something far more radical, the gentle discipline of turning his attention inward. What is mine today, he would ask himself. What belongs truly to me? Not his time, that belonged to his master. Not his body, that too was claimed by others. Not the events that would unfold. Those were written by forces beyond his reach. But his response to each moment, that was his. His choice to meet difficulty with composure, that was his. His decision to see clearly rather than through the fog of resentment, that was entirely, completely his. This practice, this daily returning to what he could actually control, began to transform not just his thinking, but his entire way of being in the world. When Epaphroditus raged, as powerful men often do when the world doesn't bend to their will, Epictetus learned to see not a terrifying master, but a man enslaved by his own emotions, chained to his need for control, prisoner to his expectations. Who then was truly free? The slave who had learned to find peace within any circumstance, or the master who could find peace only when circumstances aligned with his desires? This wasn't bitter consolation. It wasn't the false comfort of telling himself that suffering didn't matter. Epictetus felt the sting of injustice as keenly as anyone. He knew hunger, exhaustion, the particular ache of being treated as property rather than person. But he also knew something else, something that his master, for all his wealth and power, had never learned. He knew that his worth, his essential dignity, his capacity for wisdom and virtue, none of these could be touched by external circumstances. They were his, completely and forever his, regardless of what the world chose to do with his body or his time. In the kitchen of the great house, sharing a simple meal with other slaves, Epictetus would practice this freedom in the smallest ways. The bread was coarse, sometimes stale. The portion was small. The surroundings were humble. But instead of focusing on what was lacking, instead of comparing this meal to the feasts served in the dining hall above, he would turn his attention to what was actually present: the warmth of the bread, the satisfaction of hunger being met, the quiet companionship of others who understood his circumstances, the simple miracle of another day, another chance to practice wisdom, another opportunity to choose his response. "Look," he would say quietly to those around him, "at what we have been given." Not in denial of their hardships, not pretending their situation was other than it was, but choosing, deliberately choosing, to see what was actually there rather than only what was missing. This wasn't passive acceptance, it was active engagement with reality as it is, rather than reality as we wish it were. And in that engagement, in that clear-eyed seeing, he found a kind of contentment that his master's elaborate feasts could never provide. Because contentment, true contentment, doesn't come from having more. It comes from wanting what you have, from finding sufficiency in what is present, from recognizing abundance in the midst of simplicity. The other slaves began to notice something different about Epictetus. Not that he complained less, though he did. Not that he seemed happier, though there was a kind of quiet joy that surrounded him. What they noticed was his steadiness, his unshakable calm in the face of difficulties that sent others into despair or rage. When work was hard, he worked without resentment. When punishments came, he bore them without bitterness. When small kindnesses appeared, he received them with genuine gratitude. He had learned what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, the practice of aligning what we want with what actually is, rather than demanding that what is aligned with what we want. This wasn't giving up. It wasn't surrender in the sense of defeat. It was the deepest kind of victory. Victory over the tyranny of our own expectations. Victory over the endless hunger for things to be other than they are. And in that victory, he found a freedom that no external circumstance could touch. Years passed this way, years of quiet practice, years of choosing again and again to focus on what he could control rather than what he couldn't. His body bore the marks of his circumstances. His legal status remained unchanged. The external facts of his life stayed stubbornly the same. But something profound had shifted. Something that would, in time, make him one of history's great teachers of human freedom. He had learned to distinguish between what happens to us and what we make of what happens to us, between the events of our lives and our interpretation of those events, between our circumstances and our character, between what the world gives us and what we choose to do with what we're given. This distinction, this fundamental recognition of where our power actually lies, became the foundation of everything he would later teach. Not because he had read it in books, though the books helped him understand and articulate what he'd discovered, but because he had lived it, tested it, found it true in the crucible of his own experience. In those quiet evening moments when the day's work was done and the house settled into sleep, Epictetus would reflect on what he had learned. That freedom isn't the absence of constraints. It's the presence of choice within whatever constraints exist. That peace isn't the absence of difficulty. It's the presence of wisdom in the midst of difficulty. That strength isn't the ability to control what happens. It's the ability to respond to what happens from a place of clarity and virtue. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts to him. They were lived truths, practical wisdom earned through years of daily application. And as he settled into sleep each night, on his simple mat in his simple corner of a world that saw him as property, he carried with him a kind of wealth that no master could claim, the wealth of self-knowledge, the riches of inner freedom, the treasure of a mind that had learned to find peace, not in getting what it wanted, but in wanting nothing more than the opportunity to respond with wisdom to whatever each new day might bring. This was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. This quiet revolution, this transformation of bondage into freedom through the simple but profound practice of focusing on what we can actually control. This was where true philosophy began, not in the mind, but in the heart of lived experience, in the courage to find freedom wherever you are, exactly as you are, right now. Exile and new beginnings, Nicopolis. And then, everything changed. In the year 89 CE, Emperor Domitian issued a decree that would ripple through the philosophical communities of Rome like a stone thrown into still water. All philosophers, all teachers of wisdom were to be banished from the city. The edict came suddenly, without warning, without mercy. Those who had spent years building schools, forming communities, sharing wisdom, were given mere days to gather their belongings and leave. For many, this felt like catastrophe, the end of everything they had built. But Epictetus saw something different entirely. He saw opportunity. Picture him now, no longer the young slave who had first arrived in Rome decades earlier, but a man in his 40s, weathered by experience, deepened by wisdom, standing at the crossroads of his life. The other philosophers wept, raged, cursed the emperor's name. But Epictetus simply gathered his few possessions, his worn scrolls, his simple cloak, and began to walk. He had learned long ago that freedom was not about where you were, but about how you chose to respond to where you found yourself, and so he walked toward exile, as if walking toward home. The journey took him across the Adriatic Sea, to the western coast of Greece, to a place called Nicopolis. The name itself meant City of Victory, built by Augustus to commemorate his triumph at the Battle of Actium. But the victory Epictetus would find there would be of an entirely different kind. Imagine the landscape that greeted him: rolling hills covered in silver-green olive groves, vineyards heavy with purple fruit, the distant mountains rising like sleeping giants against an endless sky. The air here was different, cleaner, touched with the salt of the nearby sea and the sweetness of wild herbs growing along the hillsides. This was not Rome with its marble grandeur and crushing weight of ambition. This was something simpler, more honest, more true. Here, among the olive trees and stone houses, Epictetus began to build something new. He found a modest building, nothing grand, just a simple structure with thick walls and windows that caught the morning light. And there, in that humble space, he established his school. Word spread slowly at first, then more quickly, that a wise teacher had come to Nicopolis, that here was a man who spoke not of abstract theories, but of practical wisdom, of how to live, how to find peace, how to be free. Students began to arrive, young men from across the Roman world, drawn by stories of this former slave who had discovered something precious, something rare, something that could not be taken away by any emperor's decree. They came expecting lectures on logic, on metaphysics, on the grand questions of existence. Instead, they found something much more valuable, They found a teacher who showed them how to examine their own thoughts, their own reactions, their own choices, moment by moment, breath by breath. Among these students was a young Roman named Arrian, Flavius Arrianus, who possessed a gift that would prove invaluable to history. Arrian was a careful listener, a meticulous recorder, someone who understood that the words being spoken in this simple classroom were too precious to be lost to memory alone. Day after day, he sat in the back of the room, stylus in hand, capturing not just Epictetus's formal teachings, but the spontaneous conversations, the gentle corrections, the moments of laughter and insight that arose naturally from the community of learning. He recorded the way Epictetus would pause, mid-sentence, to help a struggling student understand a concept, the way he would use simple analogies, comparing the mind to a garden that needed tending, or the will to a muscle that grew stronger with exercise. Through Arrian's careful notes, we can almost hear Epictetus's voice, warm, patient, occasionally sharp when a student was being lazy in their thinking, but always kind. The school in Nicopolis became something beautiful, something rare in the ancient world. It was a place where young men learned not just how to argue or how to impress others with their cleverness, but how to live with dignity, with purpose, with unshakable inner peace. They learned that happiness was not something to be pursued, but something that arose naturally when you stopped chasing after things you could not control. They discovered that freedom was not about getting what you wanted, but about wanting what you had, about finding contentment in the present moment, exactly as it was. And slowly, gradually, these students began to embody the very qualities their teacher demonstrated: the calm acceptance, the gentle strength, the unbreakable serenity that came from knowing, truly knowing, what was up to them and what was not. In the evenings, when the formal lessons were done, Epictetus would often walk among the olive groves, his students following at a respectful distance. The setting sun would paint the hills in shades of gold and amber, and in that peaceful light, the deepest teachings would emerge, not formal lectures, but quiet conversations, gentle observations about the day's events, simple reminders about what really mattered. "Look at these trees," he might say, touching the rough bark of an ancient olive. "They do not worry about tomorrow's weather. They do not compare themselves to the cypress or the oak. They simply are, and in that being, they find their perfection." These walks, these quiet moments, became as much a part of the education as any formal lesson, because Epictetus understood something profound, something that many teachers miss. That wisdom is not just something you think about, it's something you live, something you breathe, something you embody in every small action, every gentle response, every moment of choosing peace over conflict. And so, what had begun as exile, as banishment, as loss, became transformation, became gift, became the very foundation of a legacy that would outlive empires. In losing Rome, Epictetus had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found home, in the truest sense of the word. Not a place on any map, but a state of being, a way of moving through the world with grace, with acceptance, with unshakable inner freedom. This was the real victory of Nicopolis. The enduring words, the legacy of the Enchiridion. And in this place of unexpected belonging, in this sanctuary born from exile, something remarkable began to unfold: the preservation of wisdom, the careful tending of words that might otherwise have been lost to the winds of time. Arrian understood, perhaps better than anyone, the precious nature of what he was witnessing each day. These weren't just lectures. These weren't simply philosophical discussions. These were distillations of a lifetime spent learning how to be truly free. And so he wrote, with the devotion of a monk, with the precision of a scholar, with the love of a devoted student. Picture him there, in the gentle light of morning, or the soft glow of oil lamps in the evening, bent over his wax tablets, his stylus moving carefully across the surface, capturing not just the words, but the rhythm, the cadence, the very heartbeat of Epictetus's teaching. He wrote down the questions that students asked, the stories that illustrated each point, the gentle corrections, the moments of laughter, the profound silences that followed particularly deep insights. Arian knew he was creating something that would outlast them all, something that would carry these teachings far beyond the olive groves of Nicopolis, far beyond their own brief time on earth. He was creating a conversation across centuries, the discourses, 8 books in total, though only 4 survive to this day, became a living record of how wisdom actually sounds, how it moves, how it breathes in the space between teacher and student. But perhaps even more precious, more enduring, was the smaller work, the handbook, the Enchiridion. 53 brief chapters, distilling the essence of everything Epictetus had learned, everything he had discovered in his journey from slavery to freedom, a manual for the soul, written in language so clear, so simple, that it could speak to anyone, anywhere, in any century. Some things are within our power, while others are not. These opening words, like a key, unlocking the door to a different way of being in the world. Arian chose each phrase carefully, knowing that brevity was not just elegant, but necessary. These teachings needed to be portable, memorable, accessible to the merchant and the emperor alike. They needed to fit in a traveler's pack, in a busy mind, in a heart that was seeking direction. And they did. Oh, how they did. Through the centuries that followed, as empires rose and fell, as languages evolved and borders shifted, these words traveled. They found their way into the hands of Marcus Aurelius, who carried them to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, who meditated on them in his tent beside the Danube, who let them shape his own remarkable meditations. They comforted scholars in medieval monasteries, guided merchants on the Silk Road, offered solace to prisoners in dungeons, whispered hope to those who had lost everything. Because this wisdom, this understanding, it doesn't belong to any single time or place. It belongs to the human condition itself, to that universal experience of struggling with what we cannot change, of learning to find peace within uncertainty, of discovering that our freedom lies not in our circumstances, but in our response to them. The Enchiridion became, and remains, a companion for the journey, small enough to carry, profound enough to change a life. Its pages have been turned by countless hands. Its words have echoed in countless hearts. Its wisdom has been tested by every imaginable form of human suffering and joy. And always, always, it offers the same gentle invitation to distinguish between what we can and cannot control, to align our desires with reality rather than demanding reality align with our desires, to find freedom not in getting what we want, but in wanting what we have. This is the gift that Arian preserved, the legacy that his careful writing ensured would survive. Not just philosophy, but medicine for the soul, not just ideas, but practical tools for living. In our own time, when the pace of life seems overwhelming, when the weight of expectations feels crushing, when the constant comparison and performance leave us exhausted. These ancient words still offer refuge. They remind us that we are not responsible for controlling the uncontrollable, that our worth is not determined by others' opinions, that peace is possible, even in the midst of chaos. They whisper the same truths that Epictetus discovered in his own journey from bondage to freedom, that suffering comes not from our circumstances, but from our resistance to them, that acceptance is not passive resignation, but active wisdom, the choice to work with reality rather than against it. The Enchiridion sits quietly on shelves around the world, in languages Epictetus never knew existed, in countries he could never have imagined, still offering its simple, profound invitation to freedom, still teaching us that we carry within ourselves everything we need to live with grace, with dignity, with unshakable inner peace. This is what Arian understood as he bent over those wax tablets, as he chose each word with such care. He was not just preserving the past, he was planting seeds for the future, seeds that would bloom in hearts not yet born, in circumstances not yet imagined, seeds of wisdom that would remind countless souls across countless generations that true freedom is always possible, always within reach, always waiting to be claimed. The enduring words, the lasting gift, the conversation that continues still, between a teacher who learned freedom in chains and students who seek it in every age, in every place, in every quiet moment when the heart asks, "How do I find peace in a world I cannot control?" And the answer comes, gentle as morning light, clear as mountain air. You begin with what is within your power. You begin with this moment. You begin with acceptance. A Stoic sunset, finding peace within. You begin with what is within your power. You begin with this moment. You begin with acceptance. And as the sun begins its gentle descent toward the Ionian Sea, casting long shadows across the olive groves of Nicopolis, we can almost see him there, the teacher who found freedom in the most unlikely place, standing perhaps at the edge of his simple school, watching the light dance on the water, knowing that another day of sharing wisdom has come to its natural close. The sky deepens from gold to amber, from amber to rose, and in this daily transformation, this eternal rhythm that no human hand can hurry or delay, we find the perfect metaphor for everything Epictetus taught, the beauty that emerges when we stop fighting what is and learn instead to flow with the natural order of things. Here, in this moment between day and night, we can feel the profound peace that comes from understanding, truly understanding, that there are things we can control and things we cannot, and that wisdom, real wisdom, lies in knowing the difference. The waves below continue their ancient conversation with the shore, neither rushing nor hesitating, simply being what they are, doing what they do, following the laws that govern all things, and in their steady rhythm, we hear an echo of the acceptance that Epictetus discovered in his small room, in his daily practice, in his patient observation of what brings suffering and what brings peace. What brings suffering, he learned, is our insistence that the world be other than it is, our demand that people behave as we think they should, our belief that we can control outcomes, reactions, the thoughts and feelings of others, the passage of time itself. What brings peace, he discovered, is the radical acceptance of what is, combined with the gentle but persistent effort to align our own thoughts, our own choices, our own responses with virtue, with reason, with love. The fishing boats in the harbor below rock gently with the evening tide, their work done for the day, their nets mended, their simple purpose fulfilled. And there is something so beautiful in their quiet rest, something that speaks to the contentment that comes from doing what we can do and then letting go. This is the gift Epictetus offers us across the centuries, this invitation to find our own harbor, our own place of rest, not in the achievement of perfect circumstances, not in the control of every outcome, but in the cultivation of inner tranquility, the development of character, the practice of seeing clearly. As the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, each one finding its place in the vast pattern, neither competing with the others nor dimming its own light, we remember that we too have our place, our role, our unique contribution to make, not by forcing or grasping or demanding, but by being fully, authentically, courageously ourselves. The evening air carries the scent of wild herbs from the hillsides, thyme and rosemary and sage, plants that grow without effort, that bloom in their season, that offer their gifts freely, and we are reminded that there is a natural way of being, a way of living that flows from understanding rather than struggle, from acceptance rather than resistance. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you carry with you this ancient wisdom, these tested truths, these gentle reminders that peace is always available, not in some distant future when everything is perfect, not in some imagined past when things were simpler, but here, now, in this breath, in this moment, in this choice to let go of what you cannot control and embrace what you can. Your thoughts. You can guide toward gratitude rather than worry, toward acceptance rather than resistance, toward love rather than fear. Your responses. You can choose with intention, with wisdom, with the understanding that how you react to what happens matters more than what happens itself. Your attention, you can direct toward what is beautiful, what is good, what is within your power to influence, rather than getting lost in the endless spiral of things you cannot change. The sunset deepens now, painting the clouds in shades of purple and gold, and in this daily masterpiece, created without effort, displayed without fanfare, we see reflected the natural beauty that emerges when things are allowed to be what they are, when we stop trying to paint the sky ourselves and learn instead to appreciate the artistry that surrounds us always. The teacher's voice grows softer now, like the evening breeze that stirs the olive branches, like the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, reminding us that the most profound truths are often whispered, not shouted, discovered in quiet moments, not dramatic revelations. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of something larger, something beautiful, something that has room for all of your imperfections, all of your struggles, all of your sincere efforts to live with wisdom and grace. Rest, knowing that tomorrow will bring what it brings, and that you will meet it, as Epictetus learned to meet each day, with acceptance of what comes, with intention about how you respond, with trust in your ability to find meaning and peace, regardless of circumstances. Rest in the gentle understanding that you don't have to carry the weight of the whole world, that your job is simpler and more beautiful than that, to tend your own garden, to polish your own character, to offer your own gifts, to find your own way of being a light in the darkness. And as the last light fades from the western sky, as the stars emerge in their full glory, as the ancient rhythms of night and day continue their eternal dance, let yourself sink into the deep peace that comes from knowing, truly knowing, that some things are within your control and some things are not, and that in this simple distinction, this fundamental wisdom, lies the key to every door you've been trying to open, the answer to every question you've been asking, the peace you've been seeking, not out there, but here, within, where it has always been waiting, patient as starlight, steady as the tide, yours to claim in this moment and in every moment that follows.